this is either going to blow up in her face or it's going to work out. And obviously it worked out.
All the lenses that I use are in that upper right quadrant. I sort of remember this.
Yeah. We had to change kind of the prescription of the design a little bit.
For the first time, I fully sort of just trusted my intuition and let that guide me.
So Alice, it's really interesting that you kind of mentioned you're the first person, actually the guinea pig, to use our F900 prototype even before Star Wars, and that's kind of your introduction to Panavision. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was at USC with Jon M Chu, and we were making a short film called When the Kids Are Away, and he had gotten a grant, the Princess Grace grant, to stay an extra semester and do this short film, which was a musical. And he wrote a letter to Bob Harvey here at Panavision at the time. Panavision was developing this camera and that Star Wars was going to use it. And he wrote a letter that said, it pitched our project and said, we really would like to shoot on the Panavision Sony F900. And there was only a prototype at the time. And somehow as students, we got it. And that was the first time I ever came to this building, was when we prepped that camera. And that was my real introduction to Panavision.
From there, you start off spherically, but I've noticed that you've kind of really embraced the use of anamorphic. And I really started to take notice of your abilities with In the Heights.
I always like to create a sort of big question or a goal for each movie. And In the Heights, the question that I came up with is, what is it like if the streets were made of music? This movie has themes of It's a Wonderful Life and of finding home and what home means. As we were testing lenses, I had shot with these on this TV series, and I really loved the vignetting of the G Series. I loved that I'd feel very immersed in the character very quickly. And with In the Heights, we were shooting on real locations using mostly available daylight. It was wonderful because our AD worked with us so that we shut down an intersection in Washington Heights for like a month. We would be shooting so that the sun was in the right place all the time, which is interesting because then I go do Wicked, which is a much bigger movie. That wasn't possible because there was just too many moving parts. But for some reason on In the Heights, I could say, okay, I want to shoot this at 4:59 p.m. because I know the sun is going to be right here and I want the flare. But I knew the sun was going to play a huge part. We have a number called When the Sun Goes Down, and the opening and closing numbers all take place on this intersection where you can see the George Washington Bridge in the background. We shot in June and July in New York, and the sun only sets on the north side of the George Washington Bridge 2 days a year. And we did all these light studies where I'd sit there with the camera and the G Series lenses and start to figure out how can I use these lenses to our full advantage to when I am using available light and being outside almost all of the time in this movie.
If you're like, say, for instance, further north and you're down more in the summer months where the light has to travel it's not at direct, it has to travel through different atmosphere, and you get a different quality of light versus being at a more southern latitude, which is really influential. And you're thinking already, let's use this magic hour to get the light. Taking advantage already of the type of coatings that were used in the Gs and the glass types that are in the Gs. So it happens, it kind of warmed up and gave you kind of a warmer palette more naturally, where some of the more modern glasses might have rejected some of the blues and gave you kind of a flatter.
Oh, that's interesting. The summer in New York feels different than anywhere else in the world. And it's because the light zigzags from building to building. And in Washington Heights, unlike a lot of New York where there's red brick, Washington Heights has yellow brick. And so that does create a warmth, but it's a different warmth than hitting off a red brick.
Right. It's really interesting, the quality of light of New York versus LA. It's completely different.
Completely different.
It threw me for a curve for the longest time when someone says, no, this is New York light. I was like, what are you talking about? The sun is the sun. And
no, it's not.
But the latitude and the angle it hits it is very different. And now that you kind of expose that, you have this kind of natural kind of yellow bounce complemented with the coatings and the textures or the glass types of the G Series.
And the cool shadows too. I mean, our shadows were quite cool naturally, and that is also something that happens in New York.
Do you use the the score and the soundtrack to help inspire you with your lenses and your composition and the way that you pull in the color to kind of complement the fact that it's harmonious with music?
Yes. So on In the Heights and on Tick Tick Boom, the second I got both of those movies, I started listening to the music all the time. It was at a time I was running also, so I just like put on my headphones and go running every morning, and I'd listen to the music. And that was all during our camera tests. And we didn't know what camera we were going to shoot with, what lenses we were going to shoot with. But it all is part of the feeling. I mean, music is so much about emotion and feeling and what that music creates.
Right. It's really interesting that the way that you classify the lens vibrations is very similar. You think of the lens not as a mechanical ones and zeros, it's a mathematically driven tool. You think of it as hints and notes, and that's very similar how we like to define lenses. It's really about the emotion that the lens presents, and this is kind of an abbreviated version of what the lens can do, but you can see the G series, the lenses that you kind of gravitate to, are actually in a quadrant kind of by themselves.
Wow,
where you have a contrast, but they're soft. So if you think about it, resolution is kind of overrated. It's really the contrast that drives you. And if anything, you don't want too much resolution, because the last thing you want to do is point out too much detail. You want to be able to use that like a pastel. And that's the way that you speak so romantically about a lens and tuning it to music really fits very nicely with how we like to classify lenses.
All the lenses that I use are in that upper right quadrant, and the G series are all on their own. They're in this sort of higher contrast, softer world of this chart. And the way Jon Chu and I approach musicals, in the same way Lin-Manuel Miranda and I approach musicals, is definitely from the inside out rather than the outside in. So the close-up is everything. And finding a lens that can create the close-up that pulls something extra out of the character, that has that magic.
I'd say we really started collaborating extensively in Tick Tick Boom, where you already had kind of a cognizance with Anamorphic, with the elongated depth of field you wanted to give like a more stage-like look. You really took advantage of the natural astigmatism. And then if you think about the way a digital camera loses vertical resolution on the de-squeezing process, you really gave it depth, because it was almost like this kind of a frame of what was in focus, where you focused your audience. I'd imagine myself watching a play on a stage where your center of gaze is what you want to pay attention to, and the way that you framed it with the anamorphic lenses, you really took advantage of the fact that the anamorphic lenses really focused you into a zone.
So on Tick Tick Boom and In the Heights, our location work is, we're in the smallest New York City apartments, and then we built Jonathan Larson's apartment on Tick Tick Boom, but it was built to scale to what his apartment was. So it was very tight. And I think I used the G series to an advantage in those spaces, and the natural vignetting of the lens helped me battle the fact that the walls were a light color, and to focus our attention and draw our eye to exactly where I wanted that attention drawn. 2x squeezed anamorphic lens is probably not your typical choice for movies that do take place in such claustrophobic spaces, but the G series became our hero lens on Tick Tick Boom.
What was interesting about Tick Tick Boom is you had the safe set, which was the one like, okay, if I get backed into a corner, I'm going to pull out the safe set, or I have information. And then you had your artistic set, where we induced more astigmatism, we framed it. And I remember that it was a learning process for both of them, because we kind of had a trade-off back and forth. We finally got it.
That's right, we did. That first set that you tweaked wasn't what it was. I can't remember what it was, but
yeah, like I went too brute force, because again, you love that soft palette, but you wanted to maintain the contrast. But in this case, you also wanted the palette to have kind of a framing effect. So what I did, I just went, okay, let's just give her the full degree of adjustment. I overswirled stuff, and it fell off too strong. And then we finally got your recipe right. And I noticed that even back then, that you didn't define your lenses by flare. You used it very carefully by using the veiling glare characteristics. You really took advantage of the astigmatism and the fall off, which was really, really very mature of you as a cinematographer, to understand that anamorphic was more than just a lens as a pretty flare.
For me, it's all intuition. I tell a story emotionally, and that's what I love about working with you is that I could just come to you with all this emotional information, and somehow you then can take those emotions and create the lens that exactly the way I dreamed of it. And the flare is a nice piece that can be used in certain moments to help accentuate a moment, but it's all the other characteristics of the lens that's really important to me.
So basically, if we look at our anamorphic, our 240, this will be our safe set, and this will be our artistic set. So what you liked on that, on the safe set, is the G Series, as a general rule of thumb, were kind of loosely based on the C Series design. So we always had a little bit of sagittal astigmatism where it kind of split.
Yep.
And then you had kind of a zone like this. So, but what you were saying on, for the apartment stuff where we had the artistic set, we wanted to increase the sagittal astigmatism, which is that's kind of split here. So we kind of expanded it like this a little bit more, so that it fell apart, and then our sweet spot became more concentrated into a smaller area. So what happens is that when you framed your subject, that this was in focus and this fell off much faster. It was almost like tunnel vision where you kind of focused them in there. So my mistake when we first were going back,
I sort of remember this.
Yeah, I went too heavy and I started swirling it, and you said, "Yeah, this looks really pretty, but it looks too much. Like it's distorting the edges. It's taking away from like this kind of fantasy reality that we had." So we had to pull back here. So what we had to do is we had to change kind of the prescription of the design a little bit to get rid of the swirl as much and get more kind of like a fall off like this. Right. And it was, I guess you could almost call it like optical Vaseline, where we kind of just kind of blended it, because you had a really...
And it's so pretty. We lit that movie almost entirely with practicals. And we used some movie lights, but our sets had hard tops to it, so it was tons of practical work. And the way the practicals play on the edges of our frame is on the artistic set was gorgeous.
Yeah. So we muted them naturally already on both sets, but more so on the artistic, on the edges. We managed to scatter the contrast more on the edges so that it would roll off with the...
I think I probably sent you my lookbook for that, and it was a lot of like Nan Golden photography from the 1980s, which does have a softness to it, and lots of practical light. And then I also sent some of my own family photos, because I grew up in New York City in an apartment very similar to Jonathan Larson's, and so I drew on my own inspiration of what New York City looked like from a childlike perspective, because I was 10 when this movie takes place. Lin-Manuel Miranda really wanted it to feel like Jonathan Larson was a child who couldn't grow up. And so now when I look at this drawing, it feels exactly like Jonathan Larson's view of the world. We were in post on In the Heights, and John called me and said that our next movie is going to be Wicked. And we started just having these conversations about what we wanted Oz to look like. In the first Wizard of Oz book, there are over 100 references to a rainbow of color. And so I wanted that to be our inspiration. And whereas The Wizard of Oz is told from Dorothy's point of view, Wicked is told from Elphaba and Glinda's point of view. And they grew up in Oz. They don't know anything else but Oz. And so we're creating the land of Oz from a totally different viewpoint. We talk about one-word emotions. And like for the first movie, some of those emotions were longing and desire and choice and power and friendship. And for the second movie, the intentions were seclusion and separation and surrender and consequence. And very quickly it became clear that the movies would have two distinct looks, that there would be one continuum for the entire movie, and the continuum ended up being the Ultra Panatar 2s. As soon as I talked to Mark Platt and I knew I had the job, that's when I called you. You started telling me about the idea for the UP2s. Of course, they weren't even called UP2s at the time. For these new anamorphic lenses, I realized we had the opportunity to use a lens no one else had used before. So it was going to be a completely different experience than anyone had had, because it was completely new.
Up to this point, people have been very conservative, anamorphic, and I don't think we ever, other than killing them softly for 35, we never took an anamorphic lens to the level that we did.
Oh, interesting.
And then especially you compound that with the Lexus 65, and it's like, man, Alice is taking a serious chance on this movie. She's like pushing the limits of what's acceptably in focus and what's out with the textures. You're kept pushing the lenses in a way similar to Tick Tick Boom, but even more aggressively, which I thought, oh my God, this is either gonna blow up in her face or it's gonna work out. And obviously it worked out because
we didn't have that many lenses when we landed in London, but we did have a 65. It was the close focus 10-inch 65. And I remember we shot on that 65 millimeter lens on this close-up of Cynthia Erivo during a makeup test. We dollied from like probably 20 feet all the way into her, but Jon wanted to be able to see every single line on her face, but he wanted to see if the green makeup would break. And so we pushed all the way into this close-up of her. When we went and projected it, it made everybody cry in the room. And Jon said to me, those are the lenses we're shooting on. Which ones are they? And I said, they're the prototypes. And he said, okay, that's it. And the power of that lens to create emotion with nothing else going on was remarkable. And so that was it. Everyone was sold.
With Wicked, it wasn't just about one thing, because all the stuff that we hear about associated with Wizard of Oz is the color of Wizard of Oz, the first Wizard of Oz, black and white, to the sensational colors. But with you, it wasn't just about color, it was about texture and how to carve it. That even though that you had a certain color palette in mind and you want to work about it, it was more important to you about the texture, how you can separate foreground and background. You had this kind of intuition that it's going to be anamorphic. We had these old lenses called UPs that have a weaker squeeze. So I kind of showed you that at first, but we looked at it, you says, this isn't really anamorphic enough. I need more oomph. You're one of the early adopters that really understood the subtractive effect of anamorphic, how you're maximizing the weaker squeeze against the sensor, because traditionally in the film world, when we had anamorphic, you would squeeze it onto film and then you'd unsqueeze it with the projection lens, so it was kind of lossless. But in the digital world, there's no digital desqueeze. So what you do is you remove vertical pixels. So your vertical resolution is always at a deficit by a factor of 2 to your horizontal. Well, with the Ultra Panatar, since you're only moving 1/3 of those pixels, you maintain that kind of relationship between vertical horizontal resolution much better, which gave us the power to give you more artistic. I can burn in more aberrations because it wouldn't get blown up on the the de-squeeze process. So that was something that your intuition there, it resonated with you. Like you're saying, the lenses just had a different feel. And I remember you're saying these have a different look to them. And that was because you gave us that kind of leeway to push the lenses in a direction that I couldn't do with 2X.
So I remember one of the questions you asked me when I first came in, you said, which I had never thought about, you're like, we can make the lens flare any color you want. And so we started talking about it because I was worried about the anamorphic blue flare. It just didn't feel like the right choice with the green and the pink. And so then I think you suggested amber at some point, right?
You're kind of describing over this large format of the sensor. It was kind of a surprise, is that the flare initially had an amber, but as it traverses across the Lexus 65 sensor, it would start to change color a little bit and pick up these different hues. So depending on the type of light source you had and the incident angle that the light hit the lens, you would get this amber inspired flare with different hints of color that we applied into the UP2s, which is really interesting because when we developed the UP2s, we were kind of like, what are the characteristics? Because you came off using 2X anamorphic, which really made me think that the language is that 1.3 wasn't anamorphic enough. And I thought, well, what is it that makes an anamorphic lens anamorphic? An anamorphic lens just isn't the flare. It's not just the way the bokeh. It's a culmination of the fact that your vertical and horizontal have two different fields of view. Because of the two different fields of view, and we always have this kind of negative barreling and this kind of undercorrected astigmatism, which means when something goes in and out of focus, it doesn't just go out of focus in a circular manner. It goes out in this kind of really dreamy elliptical manner. The reason why the 1.3s didn't look really strong is we weren't using glass that was strong enough or that had the characteristics of a 2X. So we thought, well, let's try with Alice. Let's throw in some of the G series characteristics that she liked with the out of focus characteristics and the kind of the fall off. And introduce that to the 1.3s. Instead of making the 1.3s these kind of sterile lenses that look almost spherical, let's give them personality and punch that you've kind of taught us with Tick Tick Boom. And that's kind of where we started pushing all these into the lenses, because we used to define anamorphic, like these 5 tenets, the softness, the distortion, the magnification, the perspective, and the flare. And we thought, the flare, we already have a decision, but let's really target these other 4 attributes.
Yeah, no, it was my concern that we had come off of a movie where we were used to the 2 times anamorphic, and then suddenly where we're in 1.3, and when we did look at the Ultra Panatars, they did not feel anamorphic to me, and that was a problem for me. I wanted there to be lens characteristics like the G series. So I wear contact lenses, and I do have an astigmatism. The first 2 hours of a day, I don't put in my contacts, and I can't see. Like I have about the 65 close focus vision. So I like to see the world that way. In London, we rented a flat, and it had this beautiful garden out the back, and the colors were incredible without my contact lenses on. And there's a beauty to that way I see the world every morning. And the UP2s, it's the closest lens I've ever had to if someone else were to be in my head in the way I see things. It's not tangible. It is a feeling I have every morning when I wake up. And I love not being able to see things crisp. And I love the softness on the edges. I guess that's what we did, which was create the way I wanted to see, and Jon Chu wanted to see Oz with these lenses. So I'm really grateful to you. So thank you, Dan.
Oh, no, I'm grateful to you. You used them and you drove us in a direction that we're so grateful.
Oh, I know what I want to tell you. So I use every single color of the rainbow to like different scenes in Wicked. And in our end number called For Good, which is what the title comes from, the last song between Elphaba and Glinda, we use 2 colors. We use a moonlight color, which is this blue, which is the color of Glinda and Elphaba's love. And then we also use orange flame, and orange is the color of Elphaba's transformation, and we see it in Kiamako Castle where Elphaba's hiding out. It's real flame, huge torches that we lit with, and then we used flame bars as well. And the number of people who have come up to me and said they have never seen flame look so good in a movie that was shot digitally before. There's no visual effects enhancements. It's just it's the flame out of focus in the background with these lenses that I think was the magic recipe.
Wow. With your production designer, how did you cope with such a large field of view and a different squeeze? How did you guys kind of manage with each other?
So I wanted to shoot the 2:3:9 aspect ratio. One of the reasons was because I have this movie about 2 women, and I wanted to be able to split them in the first film 50-50, and in the second movie most of the time they're apart. And so it gave me a chance to shoot them very differently. And in the second movie, Glinda is now, the world revolves around her. And we see her in these refined shots, and she's in circles and bubbles, and we do these beautiful classic Hollywood style moves into her, whereas Elphaba is raw and tangible, and she has all this emotion and all this heat inside of her and passion and power, and we shoot her in these incredibly tight close-ups and handheld. So the lenses gave me the ability to do both of those things, and then when we put them together, we go back to our framing. When Nathan came on board, he wanted to shoot everything in like fields, whereas the color for me was what was inspiring about the original L. Frank Baum books. For him, it was the nature written inside those books, and he wanted everything to come from a place of nature. So we started looking at real locations, but the reality of the size footprint we were to go and shoot at many of these locations was prohibitive. So then instead he just started building these massive sets. The sets were epically big like Ben-Hur or Cleopatra or Spartacus. People cannot understand the size of the sets unless they stood on them. Our interior sets were built 45 feet high, and our exterior sets were built 65 feet high. And the fact that we were using 1.3 squeeze and we were in a 239 crop made it so we could almost do everything in camera, because there was very little set extensions. It would take 20 minutes to walk from one side of the set to the other. It was so huge, but it also gave me a world to shoot in that wasn't all of a sudden everything. It wasn't like, okay, we're just going to be in blue, or we're going to shoot volume, but then we're going to replace all of it anyway. So it gave me real tangible spaces to be able to light in, to be able to see what my depth of field was doing on these huge sets, and to let the world actually fall away. We shot at a 2.8 almost the entire movie, and I love these lenses at a 2.8. At one point I played with the idea of, should we shoot with two different sets of lenses since they are two distinct worlds? And we're shooting these movies simultaneously. I had many ways to track how we were going to switch between visual styles within a day, and we'd have to rig lights that were only used in the first movie and then turn them off in the afternoon, and then use different lights for the second movie. But using these lenses gave me still a point of view through which to see the world.
I mean, how did you keep track of the lighting from
one movie to the other?
Meaning that you're going to be, the same day, you're going to be transitioning from movie 1 to movie 2, of keeping track of the lights. You must have had copious notes.
I mean, yeah, I had incredible notes. And then I did what I now call, I'm doing an animated movie, so I now understand what it's called in animation, which is called a color script. In my wall in my office, and then I had a digital document of it as well, we had a catalog of thousands and thousands of images, but in the end I would whittle it down to one image per scene. And if you looked at my office wall and stood back, and it would just be like thumbnails almost of what, and their references would be from our camera test, or from concept art, or from other movies, or from art, or from a still that I took walking down the street of light coming through something. So if you stood back and looked and sort of soften your eyes, I could do it by taking out my contacts, soften your eyes and look at it, you could see the contrast change and the brightness change, and where we were sort of in the same look for a while, and then where we shifted, and you could see the color story shift throughout. But I could look at my wall and see the entire movies in one view, and then we'd create weekly at a glance packets for the team that had these stills in them, so that on any given day or moment we would know where we were supposed to be visually in the story.
Wow. It's quite
There's a lot to
orchestration.
Track. Yes. There's this living quality to Wicked, that part of it's the lenses. Lens to lens, they still weren't like exactly perfect. Mm-hmm. And that imperfection plays into it. The way the lens is focused, none of them exactly were the exact same. Our close focus were different on each lens. It felt alive. And so for being this huge sort of fantasy movie, we had this real tangibility of humanity and imperfection and messiness and texture that the lenses gave us in combination with everything. We did thousands of live lighting cues instead of programming things into time code, so that we did live singing on set. And so when an actor took a breath, suddenly we could do this lighting cue that wasn't necessarily planned. And so no take is the same, just like none of our lenses were the exact same. Nothing was 100% technically precise, and that's what Jon wanted. He didn't want it to feel like a big machine was making this movie. He wanted it to feel like a whole bunch of kids in a playground making a movie. That's the experience we all had as a crew together, and we really fell in love with each other. We all had the permission to play and to try things, and if we messed up, we messed up. There's this almost the last scene in the movie where we shoot this in-camera split screen between Elphaba and Glinda, and Jon wanted to do this split screen live in camera, because Elphaba puts Glinda in a closet and it's their final goodbye to each other, and they have this moment together, and he wanted them both to have this moment at the same time. I said, we need the wall ripped out to do it, and Nathan said, if you rip the wall out, you can't shoot on this set again, because it was like this very important wall that sort of held everything together. And Jon goes, I don't care, I want to do it this way. So we rip out this wall, we put the camera there, we don't move, we're just on our 40 mil lens, it sits there, they're split perfectly 50-50 sort of, but the wall is not straight. When we ripped it out, there's a little diagonal to it, because that's the way the construction team had built it. So again, a level of humanity instead of just a perfect split screen. And so it really did feel alive.
It's a true organic nature. I love that Jon Chu noticed that there's nothing you can do technology wise would have added that kind of human essence that you guys put in naturally. I love the lighting cues too. That was random. It's like a stage play.
It's like a stage play, and we started playing with like moving sets on In the Heights, where we do a dance on a side of a building, and we had a hydraulic wall, and we don't cut, so it makes it feel like these people are defying gravity on the side of a building. And we have lots of in-camera special effects where we move walls out of the way. In Wonderful, Jon Chu kept saying, I want this to feel like the Peter Pan ride at Disneyland. He wanted an actual ride for our cast to get on and ride, and he wanted them to get on this broomstick ride and ride from the top to the bottom, where they meet the wizard at the bottom of the stairs. But the set had already been constructed, and we couldn't pull walls out. And we had 3 weeks before we were going to film this number. So special effects figured out how to put this track in, and then which was great. But then I need a crane to be able to track them from the top to the bottom. So then we had to figure out how the crane fit in with this track. So we had to work with special effects of that. And then suddenly I have this huge lighting setup that wasn't planned for, where we need to take all the lights down, and then dims to this pink color, and then it switches to green. And then as we get to the bottom of the ride, all the color dims out and we're back into our neutral color palette. That was sort of our sandbox, which was Jon Chu would suddenly have this idea, and then we all would just go, okay, let's figure out how to do it. And then in the wizard's throne room, he wanted this sort of swirl of rainbow of color. And the rainbow represents all the possibilities for Elphaba. And she has this moment where she can either stay the Wicked Witch of the West, be demonized by everyone, or she can join the wizard. So we wanted this swirl of color, and the throne room is built in this series of concentric circles, 45 feet high in the air. I asked construction to put 10-inch spaces between each of these concentric circles so that I'd have room for lights. We programmed the swirl of light, and it took 2 weeks to program those lights.
Just based on the complexity of the sets and the situation, the lighting, and Jon's kind of whimsical nature, you had to pull every trick out of the bag that you've culminated from your career to pull this off.
And knowing Jon, and knowing that yes, we could have storyboarded, done all the previs looking this direction, and then he gets to set in the morning and he starts wandering around and picking up the props and putting on a cape and swirling around, and you can see him start to act out the scene as if he were Cynthia or Ariana playing their characters. And I get there and I sit in a dark corner, and we don't even speak to each other for the first hour. We don't acknowledge each other's presence. And I just sit and I watch him, because I know as he's on the set now, on the day we're actually going to shoot, that everything's going to change. And even though we were going to look this direction, he could go, oh, but this little sliver is actually much more interesting, so we're going to do it here. And I now know always to be prepared for anything that's thrown my way.
So is this typical Jon Chu, or is this more with Wicked, that he kind of, on the day of, you had to be on your toes, ready to prepare?
No, it's typical Jon Chu. For him, it's every single choice. Keep trying and trying and trying, and then you take something and you try the wrong things. You break it in some ways. He likes to break it to see where things actually work. And we actually did that right with these lenses too, which was like sometimes we go too far, but when you go too far, then you know how far you can go. Mm-hmm. And that's the same thing with Jon, is that we're constantly stretching and stretching and stretching till till the rubber band breaks, and then you go, okay, well, we know now what our limit is. I've known him for 25 years, and we have different paths, right? He got out of film school and suddenly was on the front page of Hollywood Reporter, and I struggled as a cinematographer for a really long time, and he suddenly was doing huge movies that I was never going to be hired on. But when we found each other again on the Legion of Extraordinary Dancers on the LXD, and we had this 3-year period to explore, it also gave us a level of trust and a level of knowing each other so well. Many people go, oh, it must be easy to work with your friends. And we always say, no, it's actually incredibly uncomfortable, because we expect so much more of each other. And we also always are pushing each other to grow as artists and storytellers, and not just sort of sit in our comfort zone. And so your level is, we've hit this level, so now let's go to the next level. And so there's a constant, okay, we're not just going to do things because it's easy or because we've done them before. There's not a single musical number in Wicked or Wicked for Good that repeats itself. Everything is new and inventive and creative, and the things we did on In the Heights are not the same things we did on Wicked.
You're always redefining yourselves.
Yeah, I grew up in New York City with very little money, and my family struggled tremendously. And so I think I always am okay with a level of being uncomfortable. And Wicked was nothing but being uncomfortable. The sets were bigger than anything I could have ever imagined. I had more people in a country I had never even been to before, let alone work with any of this crew before. And I found an amazing team that was so supportive there, that I love dearly. But I think the fact that I just grew up with so little, and that I never have had a safety net. And so I think because I never have had a safety net, I'm able to risk anything because I have absolutely nothing to lose. And so going into Wicked, which is no different than my life. Like, life has been so big, and until I met my husband, I had absolutely no one who was there if I fell. And I think I was able to step into the complete unknown with Wicked just because I had nothing to lose.
This is probably one of the most anticipated musicals of the decade. There was many expectations. So you had many eyes looking at you, knowing that you weren't afraid to take chances. Do you think that really helped transfer that energy to your crew, to help inspire them to have kind of the same can-do attitude?
Yeah, I mean, in the spirit of Elphaba, I definitely look at the world in another way. And there were things I did that when I got to London, like I would have movie club on Wednesday nights where we would all get together and watch a movie, but it had nothing to do with Wicked. It was about us just talking to each other as artists and getting to understand each other's tastes. So it was like a book club. We'd watch a movie and then have a conversation for an hour about the movie. We had spent all these months prepping this movie together, 6 months prepping this movie together. And then suddenly we're now on the eve of our shoot, and I sent an email that just sort of said, okay, these are the rules that we sort of created, and then these are the rules we're breaking. And I gave everyone permission to sort of be expressive and be creative and lend their full creativity. Jon asks every one of his team to dream bigger than they've ever dreamed before. And in that spirit, I also invited my team to do the same.
From Tick Tick Boom to Wicked to your commercials, it's always you want to reinvent. You want to push that limit a little bit harder. You want to, even like before we even started rolling, you're saying, what's new? What can we do?
Yeah, I know.
So what in your mind, what are the mechanics of why you drive into using Anamorphic to showcase movies that more times than not, people go to a traditional spherical route?
What I love about musicals is one note can tell you what 100 words can't tell you. And it's the same thing with Anamorphic. The way one eye can be in focus and everything else falls off can tell you so much about a human being, can tell you so much about a character, and can tell a whole story. And I think anamorphic lenses are so specific, and each one of the beautiful lenses you sent to us in London had its own story, and we used each lens in its own way to tell different stories. I mean, even to the point where Elphaba's close-up lens was a 65 millimeter and Glinda's was a 75 millimeter lens. And at the very end of the movie, Glinda finds her power and the grimoire opens for her. And when that happens, I switched and I shot her with Elphaba's 65 millimeter lens because I wanted part of Elphaba to live inside of Glinda always. And it was a nod to what goodness truly is, which is the 65 millimeter close focus lens.
Oh, that's a beautiful answer.
I'm just so proud. It was the most joyful, wonderful experience. For the first time, I fully sort of just trusted my intuition and let that guide me.
What am I supposed to say again?
If you enjoyed this video.
Enjoyed this video.
Oh, that was like 20 takes. Remember I couldn't do that? I think I could never be an actor.
Yeah, I know. It's
I have the
fairly
memory of a
uncomfortable.
goldfish when it comes to lines. I already forgot what I was supposed to say. If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe for more.
Can we get that exact same thing into the center camera now?
Which one? Oh, if you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe for more.